Welcome to Talking with Machines, the space where Bryan Alexander, Tom Haymes, and I gather for conversations about designing the future of learning using digital tools. Today, our guest is Dr. Chris Gilliard, co-director of the Critical Internet Studies Institute and a former visiting research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center. I'm Mark Corbett Wilson, a lifelong learner, artist, and retired high-tech glassblower. I spent 2 decades working in Surveillance Valley, making gas lasers, X-ray tubes, and the high-intensity lamps used in the manufacture of computer chips. Now, I'm a critical digital humanist, learning technologian at the Western Institute for Social Research in Berkeley, California, and a digital storytelling facilitator with storycenter.org. In sum, I'm a working-class educator in third spaces, helping people glean meaning from their experiences and tell stories. Friends, please introduce yourselves.
I'm Bryan Alexander. I'm a senior scholar at Georgetown University, where I am a futurist specializing in the future of higher education.
I am Tom Haymes. I'm a teacher, consultant, author, and all-around curmudgeon. Currently I am launching a startup which seeks to visualize AI products.
And I'm Chris Gilliard. In addition to the things you mentioned, Mark, I am currently working on a book due out next year from MIT Press called Luxury Surveillance.
I love the title. And to those that don't know you, you are also hyper visible on different media platforms. So tell us what else you've been up to lately besides writing your book.
Well, that's that and co-director of the Critical Internet Studies Institute. That has been kind of my main gig for a little bit now. I had been a longtime teacher of writing and composition, but I recently resigned, and so yeah, that's what I do now.
Okay, well, we've been talking about the future of learning or education, however you want to phrase it, and digital tools here. Have you been investigating large language models?
Well, it's pretty interesting. The timing of some of my various endeavors is such that I've never been teaching, even though I have been teaching for decades. I have not taught since the release of since OpenAI released the first I don't know what number it is, but the big release for ChatGPT. I've never taught when students had access to that. So I have been following along, reading as much as I can, commenting on it, uh, paying attention to what some of the tech barons say about uh, AI. But I have not, yeah, I've not. I don't know that I would call it a pleasure, right? But I've
You're in
not
for a
had the
real treat when you do
experience.
finally teach.
I've not had the experience of teaching when these tools have been widely available.
Do you use the tools as a writer?
No, absolutely not. I am uh, the friendliest term I could attach to myself when it comes to these tools is an abolitionist. Um, but for my own tastes, as someone who has a doctorate in rhetoric, who very much connects thinking and writing, and who has spent decades developing my own style and process for writing. I and I should add, with some knowledge about how these tools are developed, um, what their training data comes from, things like that. I do not. I mean, this might seem like a heresy, but I actually have never. I've never. I don't even know what the website looks like. Like, I've never had the app on my phone. Like nothing. Like I've never used them.
So I think we met in a privacy and security workshop at University of Mary Washington, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's
So
correct.
It sounds like you're still taking privacy and security more seriously than I am. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how, and that was 6 or 8 years ago. So tell me how your thoughts have developed along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't even thought about it from a well, I shouldn't say what I should say is that everything I just said, that was sort of privacy and security aside. I mean, I'd be happy to talk about it in that regard. But um so to expand on what I said, it's very important to me to when I think about writing, and one of the people I think who does a great job of delving into this is John Warner. But when I think about writing, I think about a process by which we come to not only understand something about ourselves, but we figure out what we know, what we don't know, what we want to know. Um, and, also, I think uh, writing is collaborative in a sense, and there's an aspect of community in a sense that's really important to me that I don't want to lose. And so when I think about, for instance, the prevalence of toxicity that is built into some of these models, whether that's being scraped from some of the most awful parts of the web or being trained on various aspects of misogyny and racism, um, having sometimes CSAM as part of their training data. That's a thing that for my taste, right, and for how I think about writing and how personal it is and how um, invested I am in using writing as a tool to know myself and to know what I think. Uh, I'm not. I think that using those tools in that process for me, and I can speak to how I think about how other people should do it. Uh, but for me, it's just not. It's not a thing that I'm interested in. I haven't found. I've not seen any convincing argument that it would help me become a better writer or anything like that.
So how would you suggest, students in particular approach this whole mess?
And
Yeah,
and if you could at the same time elaborate on your vision of writing as a collaborative community, are you talking about having people read your drafts or
absolutely. I mean,
okay,
so for instance, so I'll take those in reverse order.
yeah.
So as I mentioned at the top, I'm working on a book, and one of the things I do with the book, and I'll say up front, people say that they do this with some chat bot or other, but I occasionally will write 200, 300, 500, 1,000 words and just send it off to a friend. Say, hey, what do you think of this? And they'll come back and say, well, I get this part and I don't get that part. This is really interesting. Or this is fantastic and I want you to do more of this. Or, I don't think this is really part of your core um, message for the book or anything like that. And there's a lot to be gained from that. Uh, but one of the most, so I'd identify two things. One is I have relationships with these people who I value. I know what they think. They know what I think. Um, we share a lot in common in terms of how we look at the world, but also they bring a particular perspective, um, which I think is a thing when we're talking about chatbots in this regard, in terms of like, could it be a partner in your writing? From my perspective, they don't have a perspective. And what I mean by that is, um, if I send it to a friend, they are a person who operates in the world, right? Who can think and smell and who has a history, who, exists in a body, who knows me. And I think all those things matter when we're talking about writing. because there are different forms of writing, but I think with a lot of writing, what's essential is the question of audience. And so those things are not, I already think that process works really well. I enjoy it. It's important to me. Um, and there's not a way that um, a tool built by people like, or forwarded by people like Sam Altman is actually going to improve that process for me. The other thing is, so to answer your question, Mark, or to start to unravel it, I have some really deep-rooted problems with the idea that students should be using these tools to help them with their writing. Um, I could go on for the length of this podcast about them, but I will not. There's a couple things I will focus on. One is that some of Microsoft's own researchers have put out studies that suggest, or do more than suggest, that say that continuing use of some of these tools um, has a deleterious effect on people's critical thinking skills. That the more you use them, the worse your critical thinking gets. Now, so there are some arguments that could be made, and I might not even fight with people who might want to use these things in the workplace and things like that. But for people who are developing their skills, who are working on their critical thinking, who are working on their ability to research, Mark, some of my work with digital redlining, and again, some of these tools are very confidently sending out bits of information that are wrong, that have been termed hallucinations or things like that, including citations. I'm not saying anything anybody here doesn't know, but what I think is important about that is that young folks who are developing their skills often will not and do not have the discernment to figure some of this stuff out. And so I think it's a way, I think these tools in many ways kind of short circuit what some of the most essential and critical aspects of education are, particularly again for younger folks. And so, uh, you know, there's other things kind of like the environmental aspects, the toxicity, the the ways that um trying to put this kindly, but I will say this. Some of the worst people in the world want us to use these tools. Um and some of the worst applications in the world are being um these tools are being put towards uh and they often work as sort of like a permission slip or a permission system. In other words, they do a job or perform a function that allows people to say, well, look, the machine did it, and that might be targeting people with missiles or laying off or firing tens of thousands of people. Um, and so I'm simplifying it a little bit, but but by the mere fact that some of the worst, so what I think are some of the worst people in the world are our largest advocates for these tools, um, that in itself uh, makes me question how readily they've been adopted by some folks in education.
One question is, you mentioned AI abolitionism, and I'm curious, what does academic AI abolitionism look like these days?
That's actually a wonderful question. As with some other stances I tend to take, I recognize that I'm in a privileged position. Uh, Even when I was teaching, I had a level of sort of autonomy or seniority where I could say, I'm just not using these. Now, I recognize that that is not available to a significant number of people in the academic world, again, whether that's K through 12 or whether that's in colleges. So I think it is going to take different forms based on what's available to you. Uh, but I think that within that, there needs to be a pretty strong and robust understanding kind of what it means to embrace these tools. Again, like I've talked to many people who use them at work, and uh, if someone's to say, were to say to me, well, students will have to use these at work, and so they need to know about them.
Mhm.
I don't have like, okay. I mean, I can't resist that, right? And so I don't advocate sending students off unprepared. Um, in as much as you think that education is for job training, I should add that little caveat. But I think it's important to know what it means to use these. I mean, some of the reasons I laid out, some of um, the extent to which people in the global South are traumatized in order to make these models safer for us. You
Mhm.
know, the extent to which the people behind these models are now saying that anything that resembles a guardrail is, in their terms, woke and should be discouraged. I think that these things are very dangerous, um, and in a lot of ways, and I'm talking primarily about chatbots and large language models.
Mhm.
Um, in a lot of ways, they threaten to sort of upend how we understand truth. And I don't think that's being hyperbolic. There's two people I cite pretty often, and we can. I'm sure you all have show notes, and I think these two essays should be included. A friend of mine, Ali Al Khatib, has written an article, and I think the name of it is "Defining AI." And I'm gonna circle back around to your question, Brian. Um, but like this is sort of part of the answer, not sort of, like it's part of the answer. Um, it's called Defining AI. And one of the things he says in there is that he thinks that we should move away from a technical definition of AI because that cedes it to computer scientists, and think more about AI in terms of its function, of its ideological function. Um, and the other essay that I cite quite often is one by Rob Horning, and I can't think of the title of it right now, but there's a line in there that resonates with me. Um, and he was talking about Gen AI or Gen AI in terms of image production. Okay, um, and he says, no, this isn't a direct quote, but it'll be as close as I can recall, that Gen AI is a tool of power that masquerades as a tool of knowledge. You know, when people like um, Zuckerberg or Sam Altman come out and say, we don't think that there should be, we want to remove the guardrails from these systems, right? Or when Altman says something to the extent of, and we can dig up the tweets where he said this or the articles where he said this and things like that, that people should have an AI that's attuned to their belief systems. Now, we've seen what this looks like in social media. We've seen that when we have no guardrails on things, it winds up in Facebook facilitating genocide and and generating pages for white supremacist groups. I mean, these things happen, and so I think AI in the um, in terms of some of these systems that we're talking about has the potential to do a lot of that and much worse. And so what abolition looks like is understanding what the ideological project of these systems are. Um, and so it's not merely a question of do you use it or not, because in some ways it's being shoved into so many different places, that it's unavoidable. In the same way that it's very hard, and in some cases a technical impossibility to preserve your privacy, no matter how careful you are and how diligent you are. In many ways, it is now becoming very difficult to impossible to avoid these systems. But when I think of abolition, part of that is sort of recognizing, again, what I think the ideological project of these systems are, and using them, or not, with some degree of intentionality.
If I understand, and thank you for, among other things, giving me more to read. It sounds like AI abolition is a method of critique or a program for critique, not so much a question of institutional engagement.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I haven't been faced with, because I haven't taught with these systems in place. I haven't been faced with an administrator coming in and saying you have to teach a unit on it. I haven't been faced with a bunch of papers, and I'm quite, I have questions about the extent to which my students did or did not use it. I haven't been faced with a lot of situations that instructors, professors, instructional designers, and librarians have been faced with. And so, again, I recognize that some of what I'm saying, just in terms of like, I don't use it, you know, is, I don't want it to sound sort of like cavalier. Um, and so, is it a method of critique? I would say yes. But also, I mean, if I'm sort of if you put if someone pushes me, right, again, with the caveat of all I've said, like, if someone when someone asks me, like, should I use it, my answer is no, right? Like, but that is not, people have various power structures and systems that work on them and against them, where not everybody can make that decision. But if it's available to you, I mean, if that choice is available to you, um, I would say, yeah, I would suggest against it.
So maybe part of the idea is to give that kind of autonomy and that kind of choice to faculty as well as to support staff and students.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Aren't you
I-
concerned though that if I'm not talking about job training here, okay, but I am talking about students developing critical faculties, not just, I mean, the problems of AI are the problems that social media has. There's a lot of similarity there. And the reason that those problems are there is the old garbage in, garbage out formula, and that's true with Facebook, and that's true with the various wide-ranging models. If I'm trying to teach my students critical analysis to be able to deal with the realities of the tools that they're currently having to deal with, they're going to use ChatGPT whether I let them or not. And I want them to understand the pros and cons of that. And so in that sense, I'm concerned about not exposing them to it, because they're going to expose themselves to it. And so that's one issue. I want them to, it's not like it's like alcohol, right? You ban alcohol from teenagers. What do you get? You get a bunch of teenagers in the back lot of of the high school getting drunk and then driving home because only one of them has the fake ID, right? It's the same problem in the sense that the more I think you stand in between them and the tech's not going anywhere. But the other thing is not all AI is ChatGPT. And there's a lot of different things. And there's ways in which you can use ChatGPT that is not dependent on the problematic issues of the model's source material, let's just say. I always say when it comes to AI, I never look to it for answers. I only look to it for questions. And if I can teach my students that basic thing, and by the way, that's true of anything I read too. There's no difference. I mean, just because someone convinced someone to publish a book of theirs, or if they published it themselves, does not mean that it's something that's true. I mean, someone published Mein Kampf, that's an extreme example, but the point is that there's an awful lot of bad books out there too. And one of the things as teachers we have to teach our students in is that level of information literacy, no matter the source, whether it's coming from the cybersphere or whatever you want to call, the vast information repository, which the internet has become in various ways, or whether that's coming out of the library. So, I mean, that's one concern I have about not engaging with it at some level. That doesn't mean you change your process necessarily, but I think it does mean that you have to recognize that it's out there. And as a teacher, I feel obligated to do that to my students. And my institution's not telling me to do this. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of anti-AI stuff going on in my institution. My struggle is fitting it in within the strictures of the semester that I have, the systems that we have to teach under. And that I think is the real problem. Systems of grades that undermine the efficacy of learning and things like that. Because if the students think it's a stupid game, which for a lot of it is, then they're not going to engage. They're going to pick out the cheapest and easiest way to get around the system. And it's not about learning anything, it's about passing the class. And I know you taught at a community college just like I teach, and that's a constant struggle to students who aren't necessarily very good at the game either. That's the problem at some level. So,
Yeah. So, um, I'm gonna push back a little bit.
yep.
Uh, well, maybe more than a little bit. We'll see. Um, I am not convinced by the claim that students are going to use it anyway. Um, I mean, there's a segment of students who are going to use it anyway. Like that is absolutely true. Um, I know plenty of students. I know plenty of students. I have a kid in college. He doesn't use it, and I and I think some of that goes to a point you made at the very end, which is why students or what students think they're up to when they're in class or when they're at college. You know, if we go back to the research on plagiarism and, various forms of things that people call, academic honesty or academic integrity, one of the biggest reasons for that, and again, my decades of teaching backs this up, one of the biggest reasons for that is people don't see the value or the worth in what are asking them to do. Um, and so that crosses a lot of boundaries and decades, again, in terms of like why students do what they do in a class. Do they think it's valuable? Is it worthwhile? Do they feel like they have a chance to succeed? Is it connected to their other studies or work? Do they think they'll help them in the future? All these things. And if we are able to create conditions, and again, like it was really difficult. It was really difficult before ChatGPT. Um, if we are able to create conditions that satisfy students and answer those questions in an affirmative way, I think some of those things do go away. And so I will agree with you that there's always going to be a segment of people who, I mean, they're human beings, right? They're not going to behave in the ways that we want them to, or across the board. Um,
And they can still
but
become president.
but I push back a little on they're going to use it. I um to your second point, and I don't want to be reductive, but I think and so please kind of jump in here, but your articulation was that it's not just chat GPT, and there's a degree to which the question is not whether you use it but how you use it. And I don't disagree with that, but you know um the ability, that sort of discernment that you talk about, that you have, is a thing that I think as instructors, we are hoping that students develop. Uh, you know, I think some of these technologies interfere with that discernment in a way that is somewhat different and new, um, from some of the ways that we've had in the past. Okay, so like, but I mentioned this before, but I'll elaborate a little bit. So a lot of the work I've done in the past is around what I call digital redlining, and so an aspect of that is uh, the ways that so it's hard to give like a super concise example. Um, but basically, in my institution was filtering the internet, and that affected how students were able to kind of do research when they were on campus. And the classic example I gave is that students were doing work on what at the time was called revenge porn. Now is kind of more um, often called non-consensual intimate imagery. And so when students would go, not in the databases, but in a search engine, when students would go and put in the term revenge porn, okay, and there are scholarly works on this, there's tons of research on it. But when they would go to and type in revenge porn, because of the filters put on the internet, it would pretend like the word porn didn't exist. Like the system wasn't thinking, obviously, but the sort of algorithm, um, or the filter acted as if they were looking for porn, which they were not. So my students would come to me and say, "Hey, there's no information about this. We can't write on it." Now, having, being somewhat of a scholar of this in that field, I was able to say, okay, well, you should go read this, or you should go read that, or here's some articles, or here's how to get around the filter. Um, all that to say, a lot of these same issues are coming up with, whether it's AI search engines or chatbots that are doing these things. But in some ways, it's actually worse because it's not saying, "Oh, it doesn't exist." It's fabricating results. It's making up essays and articles that people didn't actually write. It's giving the names of scholars who work in those fields, but who never wrote those essays. And so one of the things I worry about is the way that these systems kind of short circuit, um, that developmental curve where people are able to develop the discernment that they'll need in order to do whatever it is they're trying to do. Um, now, I think I can guess a little bit of what you say, what you might say to this, which is, well, they'd have to like use the tools in order to do that. Um, I don't know how much I'd fight with you against that, right? And like you can speak for yourself. I don't want to sort of like straw man you or like make some imaginary guy to argue with. But um, I worry a little bit about what that. So there's a. I don't know when students are ready to do that, right? Like, is that in first grade? Is that in third grade? Are they first years college students? And some of this, I mean, maybe you know the answers to these, Um, but uh, the other thing is I um I'm gonna try and say this nicely. Uh, I I'm sure that you are a much more conscientious um, user of these tools than a lot of people and a lot of instructors, honestly, you know. And so there's, I think, a difference between sort of ideal and best practices and what I am pretty sure is going on at a lot of institutions. Um, Lastly, I will say that um, I feel like with a lot of these questions, there's sort of a um, extremist answer and a hardcore, or in a practical answer. I'm an extremist in this regard, right? Like, I don't have a Ring doorbell or I've never used a biometrics device, right, of any sort, right? Like, I've never even unlocked my phone with my fingerprint, right? And this is the extremist position that I wouldn't necessarily advocate for anyone. But I think it's important in society for there to be someone who advocates for that position in order to understand that it is possible to exist without doing some of these things. Sort of like hardliners exist for a reason. Um, I don't think everyone should be that way, but I think it's an important position to occupy.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think the issues you describe say that tell me that, and you're right, that the faculty need to be trained in this as much as the students do, in the sense of the mindful use of any tool. You can abuse Google search. I mean, any since we've gotten to Web 2.0, there's a lot of dreck on the internet because anybody can suddenly publish easily. I mean, even before that they could, but it was harder. But I just I'm I think there's a responsibility on those of us that do have that level of critical discernment, to first of all to teach that. The other thing I would say is that I actually see AI as a tool to counteract that kind of thing, because to me, it's the problem with ChatGPT and the way the chatbots work is that they are really kind of black boxes. You don't know what's going on inside of them, and so the AI things that I'm trying to build are actually a way of opening those things up so that you can see thinking and connections and process, because I understand how transformer technology works, and that it's looking for associations between words as it connects those things together. Well, I'm like, well, if it can do that, it can also associate ideas. And so you can explore bridges between ideas and use that as a way of communicating between different viewpoints and different approaches to whatever. Right. So, and that to me is the mission that I think where AI should be going and where I think its real utility will be. I think the problem right now, you're right in everything you've said about the current models that are out there of AI, with some exceptions. I mean, they're open AI, not open AI, open source AI models that work differently than say ChatGPT does, or Mistral. I mean, or Gemini, or Claude or whatever. But even those models have a utility. And where I find the most utility is when I'm taking apart things that either I wrote myself or that I am trying to analyze. And then I can go back and look at text. So I can actually load texts into a retrieval augmented generator where I'm curating the information that's going in, and then use that to say, okay, give me some connections between these books, and that speeds up my process, and that lets me see things maybe that I wouldn't have otherwise seen for time reasons, or because I've got blind spots. I know we all do when we read stuff, when we process ideas, we have blind spots. And so I can write something, give it to you. You're going to read it the way through your filter that's in your head, right? That's going to be true no matter who you are. And a good critical thinker knows how to step back from that and start to say, okay, where are my biases taking me on this sort of stuff? But AI is a useful tool for slapping you across the face and saying, here's another way of thinking about this. And that to me is the most exciting thing about AI, is actually to give me that diversity of opinion when I don't have the luxury of talking to Bryan or Mark or you, when I don't have you guys are all busy. So I send you my writing and you don't have time to read it. That's the other problem with humans, is that we tend to get really busy doing all sorts of other stuff, especially those of us that are doing lots of things, and so that's, Bryan definitely falls into that category. So does Mark. So, that's an issue as well. And the ability, my ability as a writer to get instant feedback on my writing and to make me think about it in a different way is a very useful thing because I've done it the old-fashioned way. I've written books where I've sent out drafts to people, and of the people who I managed to dragoon into reading my book, I think three actually have, and Bryan was one of them. But
Those people talk about it too.
yeah, and but you actually
Maybe
read it, so yeah.
maybe 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 I'm misunderstanding both of you, Tom and Chris, but it seems like first of all that Tom, you see AI as a site of possibilities and a site that's contested between multiple domains.
Mhm.
Uh, Whereas it seems like some critique of AI see it as not in a meaningful way, that it is a giant ball of problems. But I wonder, Tom, if what you just described, Chris, maybe I'm getting at this wrong. When I talk to John Warner about this, he'll say, I'll point out the what I see as some of the positive uses of AI for writing, and he'll say, well, among other things, you can do all those with humans, and he doesn't use this phrase, but good group design or good pedagogy. And I'm wondering, Chris, when Tom is talking about all these cool ideas and all these these ability to leap between concepts and all this kind of great stuff that he gets from AI, wouldn't he be better off finding more people in Houston, or maybe driving to Detroit and hanging out with you? Or I mean, let me know if I'm wrong here. I'm just trying to follow where you two are going with it.
I mean, I can't say. I mean, I think so, right? But I think where some of my difficulty comes from, um, like I don't know how many. So, like in one of the examples Tom gave, I don't know how many people listening to this, right? And even I think that's a select group, right? How many people who use some of these technologies know what retrieval augmented generation is, right? They don't know. Like I mean, I'm saying I wonder, but like they don't know, right? Like, and so um just from what I'm how I'm hearing Tom talk, right? Like there's a level of expertise and familiarity with how they work, right? What it looks like on the inside. I mean, he used the term black box. That is, um, I don't know if I want to say not available, but there's like a lot of people who don't have that level of expertise. And some of it, I think, is the difference between someone, you know, wielding sort of like a scalpel versus a chainsaw, you know? Um, and uh, the other thing is, I do some of this for me comes down to to specifically answer or address your question, Brian. Um, some of it comes down to, I do think that those are um the way Tom described it is like I do that when humans aren't available. Or that's part of how he described it. Uh and I do think that
Yeah.
um when well let me back up a little bit. In some ways my resistance to these technologies is formed by the ways that the people who want us to use them have talked about them, right? Like if Sam Altman had come out and said, you know oh, there's this really cool thing that you can use sometimes, when a human's not available, like to do X, Y, and Z. um, or something along those lines. But instead, um, what we have, right? And I mean, granted, I'm talking about a couple like gigantic companies, but instead, what we have is them saying, well, it can be your therapist, it can be your best friend, it can be your girlfriend, it can be your doctor. Um, you know, I mean, telling right, like in ways that I think don't account like okay, so like setting aside whether it can do these things or not, right? Like for the moment, like I don't think it can, but setting aside that for a moment, um, not taking into account the kinds of care and empathy and connection that come that are a necessary part of these activities, right? The part of having a therapist or part of having a great professor or instructor or part of having a doctor who understands your journey towards, getting better,
Yeah.
right? Is having someone who you feel like understands you, right? Um, and so because of the ways that people have like the most powerful people, with the largest models and the most money, have positioned these things as the answer to everything, and in fact have the power to stuff them into everything, you know, um, it very much sort of has induced a level of rejection because it's not being proposed as sort of a thing that you use sometimes, you know, that helps you. It's being proposed as like, this thing that can do everything is going to change the world, and if we're not careful, it's going to take over the world, right? Like, um, and so, but I do think another essay I cite often is my friend David Columbia wrote an essay shortly before he passed called "Chat GPT Should Not Exist."
Hmm. Hmm.
And, you know, again, like I I sort of want to apologize for spending so much time focusing on what some of these people say, right? Um, but a lot of times when Mark Andreessen or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, when they talk, they are giving you an insight into the ideology embedded into the technologies that they are responsible for sending out into the world, right? I mean, these things, however we feel about them, part of what they are sort of ideological agents. When they talk, they are telling us what they think about these things and what the and how that ideology is embedded into their machinery. So I'll give you a specific example. When it's been a couple weeks ago now, you know, when uh, OpenAI had the Studio Ghibli thing where you could change your photos into imitations of
Yeah.
Miyazaki's studio art,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now Miyazaki like famously said, like, I think this is an affront to humanity itself. Okay. Like again, like maybe not exactly that, but it's like pretty close. So he's like famously said when someone showed him like Gen AI, like I think this is an affront to humanity itself. So Altman comes along, and does this thing. A lot of people have written about this. Brian Merchant wrote a good thing about it. Um, and so does this thing that is basically a like sharp stick in the eye of Miyazaki. That and not only that, but like when they talk about um for instance their product in regards to art, often the way they talk about it is they take a lot of joy in the idea that um of putting artists out of work. I mean, they also say things about the democratizing art and stuff like that. We could tease that out, I think, because it doesn't hold water. But and Columbia talks about this in his essay. A lot of the ways these guys talk about these things, they don't value what I value, right? Like they don't value um, art and poetry and literature and science fiction. Um, when they talk about their technologies, they're talking about the ways that they're going to put people like me, and put people like Miyazaki, and put, science fiction writers and all these other people like out of, they're going to make us obsolete. And so all that to say that, um, it's really important, and again, we can argue about, or we're not arguing, right? But we can have a discussion about, how we might productively use these tools, how we might use them in ways that circumvent or subvert, um, the reason that they were created.
Ah,
But I think it's kind of important to, like, to look at what these people say about why these technologies exist and how they are putting them out in the world. I think that's a really important piece of the discussion.
so that's part of the critique we mentioned before. So on the one hand, we have to carefully analyze, subject generative AI models, especially the corporate ones, to critique, taking account their express ideology as well as the ideology that seems implicit in their operations. On the other hand, we also need to push back and subvert them. And I'm curious what that subversion might look like. In the chat, I was going to ask you if you'd recommend that we, instead of using ChatGPT or using Gemini, we should instead use open source tools, which would be independent of those corporate structures, or if we should use Chinese tools like DeepSeek, which come from a different political economy. Might that be one way to subvert, or is there something else we can do that would really go against the grain of the way these generative AI giants want us to use them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I do not have an answer to that. Um, I mean, yeah, Tom has mentioned some, I think, some really interesting applications. Um, and again, I do think, um, that it's maybe not a perfect analogy, right? But I think that that scalpel versus chainsaw analogy is like maybe useful, right? I think that when I wake up in the morning and look at the landscape, of this country, right? What's going on in the U.S. I think that, um, we are dealing with some very, um, particular conditions because of the ways that, I think it's, we can't separate sort of the techno aspect of, um, like what got us here, right? I think during, Trump's inauguration, if you look behind him and see Bezos and Zuckerberg and Musk, and there's one other, I
But
think it was Sundar Pichai who was there.
yeah,
Um, when you, and so did, like the way that they bankrolled it, the way that, like, like personally, right? Like, again, like, I don't know how political the podcast is, but I think it's not possible to separate the way that, the narratives and the uses of technology that, have been, that in many ways we've eagerly adopted for the last 20 years have helped us get to where we are. Um, and so
and I don't disagree with
I,
that, by the way. I
you
mean,
do disagree with
no,
that?
I don't disagree with
Oh,
that.
okay. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I
But
do.
it's a two-edged sword in the sense that, one of the things that the internet gave us, the same tools that they were using, also gave us the voices that are so threatening to them.
Hmm.
Black Lives Matters, LGBTQ plus, all of that stuff would be invisible if we hadn't empowered those voices with technology in a way that was impossible when the only technology we had was Walter Cronkite. You know,
Well, I mean, we
it
still
would
had,
it would
we've had movements
oh yeah,
before
we had
on
movements, but they
platforms.
were they
Yeah.
were much more easily marginalized when we have a broadcast media that's controlled by, again, a relatively small, and there are technical reasons why we only had three networks and PBS eventually and stuff, because you can't have everybody broadcasting on every frequency. It just doesn't work that way. But the internet, you can. And so I look at these tools ultimately, and we have to grasp them and use them in order to do this. We can't just sort of passively, yeah, you're right. If we sit back, but this is true of any media, if we sit back and let someone else tell the story, then they're gonna have tremendous power over the world. And you're absolutely right when it comes to that. But I think that to me, technology has democratized the power for people to be able to tell their stories, whether you're going from, again, Walter Cronkite and the New York Times as being your only options for, news, that various things. Right. And I know there are a lot of independent papers, but they were also very limited geographically in scope, so you could get a very different news experience in this community in New York City than you would get in a similar community, even in Detroit or something like that. And anybody who studies, all of these things. But now all of a sudden we've put this power in the hands of individuals in a way that was impossible before the internet. And I would argue the biggest problem right now is getting through the noise. And in one of the things that Trump gives us is a filter, his filter, as to what the noise means, what's really going on there. And he comes up with plots and all this other garbage that says this is all a plot by Soros and DEI to take over the world for whatever. And that's one narrative. Well, that counter narrative is already pushing back, but it's gonna have to push back, and it needs to use the same tools, or it's going to be operating at a disadvantage. And I would argue that AI gives us the ability to, again, depending on how you use the tools, can be a tremendously powerful storytelling tool as a way of distinguishing between various narrative ways. Because the problem right now is I don't have time to read every version of U.S. history. And the fights that we're having over U.S. history is whose version do we teach our children? I mean, that's really what DeSantis and those others, and people here in Texas are trying to do.
Tom, let me just interrupt for
Yeah,
a second.
yeah.
Did you tell Chris, or Chris, do you know what Tom teaches?
I do not.
I teach government. So,
So I just want to make
Yeah.
sure that was
yeah,
a
Yeah.
particularly shaped example. Sorry, go on.
yeah. But I mean, but I'm also an avid historian and a photographer. I think that these tools, we need to teach people to use these tools in order to surface their voices. And as a creator, as again, a creative artist, as a photographer, I can expose my students. I teach photography as well. So I can expose my students to the ability to take pictures that would have required years and years of training in Ansel Adams's time. And that does that make them less of a creator? Well, it makes it makes it easier for them. But if that spark and that vision isn't there to begin with, I don't care what technology you use, it's not going to suddenly appear. You have to be willing to give your heart to your writing, to your photography, to your painting, to whatever your music, to whatever you're trying to create, because that's what comes through in the end. And I don't think that the problem I have with AI art is it's soulless. If you have the AI create it for you, you're expressing the soul of something that doesn't have a soul. And it's fine for illustrative purposes. I need a picture of a large truck pulling a boat, for this article I'm writing. Sure, why not? Right?
Tom, mostly I'm trying to understand the ideas that you and Chris are so powerfully working with. You're both pushing us in some really great directions. But I can't think of a good parallel to what the objection to what you described might be. That is, if I make a work of art, if I make a movie with a lot of AI images and perhaps AI generated video, AI generated audio and text and so on, to the extent that it is compromised by the nature of AI being so problematic, as Chris about an hour ago outlined, I can't think of an equivalent of that. I mean, of somebody using a poison typewriter. I mean, maybe we could look back at creators who worked within totalitarian regimes and whose some of whose staff were threatened with punishment in order to work with them, or they had to go through multiple layers of censorship and state control. So 1930s Soviet or German film, for example, or a Chinese film produced during the height of the Cultural Revolution. I mean,
Well, I mean,
you
I
can.
think movie making is a great example. Um, you know, one thing is, okay, seeing that example, you say, if that empowers me to make a movie where no one else would do it, is that better than me not making that movie and my voice being stilled completely?
Maybe Chris.
I mean, writing is easy. Well, writing is both incredibly hard and incredibly easy. It's easy technically, anybody can write anything. That doesn't make it good,
If
right?
if I, if I think of the AI critics who are not Chris Gilliard, if I think of Brian Merchant, if I think of Audrey Waters, if I think of the whole
Hmm.
team behind the Stochastic Parrot paper and everything else, if I think of Tressie Cottom, I think what they might say instead is what we should do is fight for a society and a culture, a political economy where you didn't have that choice, where you had, as a person, you had access to the various tools and infrastructure necessary to make such art. And they weren't generative AI, they weren't LLMs, but they were some other way that you had the economic underpinnings where you felt that it was okay. You could devote time to make something like a novel or a movie or a game, and that you had the training to do that, and you had the necessary hardware and software. And that we don't do that now for whatever. I mean, we call it neoliberalism, like capitalism, or whatever. We can refer to that, but that would be the better solution.
I mean, I
Stepping in.
want to go back to a thing you said because I
Yeah.
think it's really really important to know this. I don't disagree with you, right? And like I don't necessarily want to come into the ring with you on government issues, right?
It's okay.
But the the ways that those tools have been um misshapen, you know. I mean, there's a ton of scholarship about how these tools have been used by the far right, for instance, historically, right? The web, right? Um, we can look at, again, Facebook being um, uh, implicated in the uh, facilitation of genocide, you know, um, the very conscious choices made by people like Zuckerberg, even when their own researchers come to them and say, "Hey, you are generating pages for white supremacists even when they don't ask for them. You are sending, you are, um, making young girls and women's, you're helping to create uh, issues with their, um, I'm not the
Self-image.
proper word for yeah with their self-image and things
Yeah.
like that.
Sure.
Um, and now all of these platforms are run by people who are pretty explicitly right, if not like outright white supremacists. I mean, you can, yeah, I don't know if you count Blue Sky as like a major platform. I don't, but it's the only one that's not. Like if you go down the list, all of these people have very explicitly whether you want to say it's been that they are sort of bending the knee, or whether they are revealing who they've always been, right? Again, like citing David Columbia again, like I believe this too. Like it's who they've
They're not
always
mutually
been,
exclusive.
right? It's but like, and so those tools are at this moment very explicitly tools for right-wing propaganda. What so independent of sort of how I'd like to use them, I mean, I got off Twitter. Like I was Twitter did a lot for me in terms of like increasing my profile. Like no one on here would know who I am if not for Twitter.
Same.
Um,
And I got off
but
too.
yeah, the day that dude walked into Twitter headquarters with a sink. I closed my account and I've tweeted exactly 2 times since then, and that was when people died. Um, they are very explicitly right-wing tools at this moment. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will always be, but they are now, um, irrespective of how people would like to use them. Um, and so I think that um, we're kind of looking at a different moment in regards to like how we are to think about um, how we use these platforms in terms of organizing or promoting democracy or however you want to think about it. Um,
To
and
me,
because
the solution to that problem is to regulate transparency. I mean, that's the thing. We have to be able to see the algorithms as a society. If you're manipulating the flow of information, we should see the algorithm that's doing that. And so that I know that when I get a message from Chris, it's actually Chris and things like that. Those I think are minimum requirements. And I think that's something everybody seems to overlook when they talk about regulating social media. I'm like, look, just strip their clothes off. I want to see what the hell's going on behind the scenes.
Would there be
And and then maybe we can make rational decisions about what, when they're misbehaving. So
wouldn't that
yeah,
be an argument for going for some of the open tools
oh,
like
absolutely.
the Fediverse,
It starts
Mastodon?
open starts that way. I mean, that's the thing. That's the beauty behind open. But they're clearly operating from a disadvantage in terms of scale versus these other platforms in terms of adoption. Chris is
Yeah,
100% right on that, and that gives these people tremendous power. So that's the revolution. We need to rip the power of information away from the oligarchs who are currently controlling and manipulating those streams, just like we had to do the same thing with William Randolph Hearst, et cetera, 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago, and many others. I'm sure you can give them a much longer list than I can of all the people who use the media, including our good old friend Adolf and his Volksempfänger, his radio with one station set up on it and things like that. So, but anyway, sorry.
So I'd like to have an argument.
Oh, so you think this is a Monty Python sketch? The argument clinic. I see.
So, so I have to tell you, Chris, that I've spent an inordinate amount of time on this for 4+ years now. Can't recommend it. Probably done some damage. And I've been trying to help other people understand how it works, but people don't want to take the time to really dig into, how the stuff actually works. That's a separate issue. And I do work with academics, and they don't have the time for whatever reason. So I'll set that aside. So how do I want to approach this? I want to tell you a story, and I want to create a firestorm. I better tell the story first. So, as you know, I'm a lifelong learner. And so I come at this, I understand how professors gear most of their thinking for 18-year-old people. But as someone who's approaching 80, not that, it'll be a while, I have a broader range when I say students. And so last semester, I enrolled at my local community college to take a writing class because I've been wanting to improve my writing. And I have to say, for decades, I've been saying I went to one of the worst high schools in America. So I didn't learn how to write in high school. And I say I went to one of the worst because a decade after I graduated, Ronald Reagan showed up and claimed it was one of the most improved high schools in America. So to me, that allows me to say I went to one of the worst. He just did that to poke Nixon in the eye, but that, whatever. And so I went to community college and I took an English class, and we sat on the lawn. This is in 73. We sat on the lawn and talked about smoking dope and dropped acid and went to Dead concerts. And it was a great learning experience, but I didn't learn shit about writing. Then I went to engineering school, no writing there. And I became a craftsman, no writing involved there. So I say all this to say that I took this course wanting to improve my writing. And the teacher was one of those that does the big reveal on the day the semester starts, right? So you don't get to see anything. So I read the syllabus first day of the semester and it says no AI. And so I write a very polite letter to the professor and say, well, I've been spending a lot of time on this and I'm really interested in how this can help someone of advanced age like myself in your course. And he wrote back that he took a workshop once on AI and bans it from his course. And so while I was mulling over my response, he dropped me from his course. So there's a 8 months ago story about students, AI, and higher education. So I just wanted to drop that in there. But really, what I really want to say is looking at the criticisms of AI, which I agree with 100%, everything you said, Chris. But I do use it. My position is that AI is trained on the output of the academics that we're talking about to a large extent. And my position as a craftsman and a worker who now can't afford to go to college because of what's happened since college was free when I was a kid. And I thought, hey, when I'm retired, I'm going to be able to go to the University of California for free. That didn't work out. In fact, I just checked a course in digital humanities, $2,500 for one course that would help me in my work. So my position has always been that higher education is there to reproduce the hegemonic culture that we live inside. And when I look at the Trump administration, I see just as many Harvard, Yale, and Princeton graduates as I saw in the Biden administration. And I saw just as many in the Biden administration as I saw in the Obama administration. When he gave the banksters a free pass, when my life changed, because of the economic downturn, and none of them have done anything for students that I've seen since. So I have a larger critique of the culture, of higher education, of academia and learning. And so I try to transmit that in this podcast, but also in the work I do with academics and say, you've had a reproducibility problem for 30 years that we've all been aware of. And you have problems of DEI that you've talked a lot about, but has it really moved much? And I support it completely. I mean, I'm from California. I completely support this stuff, but I'm not seeing much movement. I'm seeing a lot of talk, but not a lot of movement. So I would just ask you, Chris, since we were recently trying to lay out this utopia of a truly open platform for people to use that they would have some confidence in, but also in an open educational system that even workers could access. Do you have any thoughts along those lines?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't feel like you threw any bombs there. I don't disagree with you. Um, Particularly on kind of like what our like the power structure that sort of has persisted for um pretty much the entire time this country has existed. Um, I guess what I'll focus on is the story you told from at the beginning. Um, I think that so if people I have an advantage in how I spend my time. That most of my time is spent either writing or doing some form of research. Primarily that's about surveillance and privacy, but because um, of the way that these technologies, that this group of technologies people call AI, has been um, ushered into the culture, like a lot of times it looks like that too. Um, a big part of the problem, I think, um, is that uh, most people do not have some of the advantages I have, and I would suspect that other people on this panel have, that we have an opportunity to learn quite a bit about these systems, how they work, um, building our own in some cases, things like that. Um, a lot of people are, instructors or just like people who are not in education at all, or people of all walks of life, don't have that luxury, which is to spend a bunch of time sort of digging into what these things do, how they do them, where they work, where they are not, applicable, sort of to paraphrase Emily Bender, right? Like, um, oh yeah, I'm gonna butcher it, so I'm not even gonna do it, right? But like the extent to like which, uh, um, where these tools can and should be used and where they shouldn't. Right? She has like a really good saying about that, but like I couldn't like recall it right off the top of my head. Um, and so that story that you tell kind of resonates with me because in some ways I think it wraps up a lot of what we've been talking about, right? That um, there's a large there's a chasm between how people in power would have us use these tools um, and in some cases like what people are what they're actually able to do, but also um, what people how people understand them, what they actually are, right? Like and so that gap accounts for a lot of the reasons that we are having these discussions because people who are not uh, experts in these things. And I don't even know. I don't wouldn't call myself an expert, right? But like people who don't do a lot of reading on these tools or anything like that, like don't know their capabilities, are now expected to navigate these systems um, throughout in all these different aspects of their lives. And in some cases, are expected to be experts when they are not, and haven't had the opportunity to become. Um, and so yeah, I think that accounts for a lot of the difficulty and helps sort of explain some of the disagreements and discussions we've had. Um, I guess, uh, but to return to something that I have been pretty consistently saying throughout, I think, is um, I think when we're talking about some of the largest systems and some of the ones that are promoted by you know the giant conglomerations, right, or giant companies, corporations, they are um, ideological tools as much as like technical systems. And yeah, I think that's like important to think about when we are talking about how, when, and if to use them.
Yeah, that's where we want to sublate them or subvert them,
Yeah.
if we can. So at the Western Institute for Social Research, there's a plug for my little graduate institute that I work with as the technologian. I got to make up my own title. My concern now is onboarding or uh, orienting the faculty, the staff, and the students to technology in general, because we do distance education. So people come in, no matter where they are in the organization, you don't know where they are experientially, right? And so it seems to me that there needs to be more conversation along those lines of how do we meet people where they are? How do we identify where they are and then meet them where they are? And we use the Dreyfus model at Wiser, the acronym, which says, okay, are you a beginner? A novice? Are you a user? Are you proficient? Are you an expert? And so I'm working on, some assessment tools that be dual use. Well, it can be an assessment tool or it can be a self directed course. So if you can just click through it, fine, you're oriented, way to go. and if you have to pause at any place, then here's the resources to bring you up to speed on this particular issue in technology, whether it's hooking up to one of these video calls or whether it's using AI or whether it's using writing, that this has always been an issue with me back to last semester. Now community colleges in California, because of a change in the law, have to onboard you, but it's all just DEI assessment. There's no technical assessment. So I signed up for a strictly online course, and there was no questions about, can I take this course online? It was all demographic questions, again, which is fine, but not useful to me. And so my question to you, Chris, is your thoughts on this idea of, we have a much more diverse student body, if you want to just look at it from higher education, much more diverse student body economically, all the demographics. But I don't think we do a good job, if at all, in onboarding them into whatever level of education they're coming into.
I mean, I was a little bit siloed when I was teaching, I mean, I think one, like sort of like the level of collegiality at community colleges is a little bit different from universities. That's maybe the kindest way I can put it as possible. But, I taught first year writing, and so um, almost everyone comes in at about the same scale, the skill level when you teach first year writing.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, there's a
And
bunch
they're
of
still at
reasons
that
for that.
skill level when they get to first year government.
Yeah. Um, so that's an interesting question. I don't know. Um, but there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and I hate that I waited until almost the end to mention this, is that, um, but I would be remiss to not talk about it, in that, my other strong resistance to a lot of these tools is that they are the threat that is not only that it will put artists and authors and things like that out of business, but the very real um, desire on the part of administrators in educational institutions to either replace teachers and instructors and professors, or to like demand a level of efficiency based on the availability of these tools, right? The suggestion is that it's going to free them up for the things that matter. But usually when people say that, they're telling you that things like giving feedback and designing assignments doesn't matter. As somebody who's taught for a long, long time, like I would vehemently disagree. And so that is another part of kind of how um, where I come from in sort of my resistance to these tools. And it's not that um, I want to be careful because to some degree it might sound like I'm saying that this is it's inevitable because of the tools. Like I don't think it is. Um, but I think that the people who are most responsible for bringing them into our institutions often do not value the things that I value, um, or I think a lot of other people do. And part of how they think about efficiency or productivity is often to the detriment of people's livelihoods or kind of the well-being of students.
I see this as an opportunity, especially in this political climate. From chaos comes opportunity, some say, um, for the faculty to retake the running of these institutions. If I was a faculty member, I'd just be like, hey, it was administration made us do all this stuff. Get rid of the administration and we'll just, take over and go back to the Socratic method and avoid all these, um, challenges But of course, we'd have to spend that money on faculty. I would like to see that happen personally. But then also, I've been advocating that all, especially online courses, should be team taught, which will never happen, at least not in my
Oh,
lifetime.
that's interesting.
A subject matter expert and a distance education expert,
Yeah.
and design the courses together. If you take shifts, you cover most of the waking moments of your
So
students, so you can
inefficient
be more
though.
available.
That'd be
Berkeley,
Yeah, I mean,
Berkeley College of Music does something like this, where each online class is produced by a team of subject matter expert, and that's usually music, but also some other communication arts, a learning designer, and a technology slash media person. And because it's so focused on music, they have this interesting model where they basically they get residuals from how many times people have completed their classes, which is consistent with the music business. And it's an interesting way of doing it. Apparently, it's been a big success for them. But I mean, that's one niche of higher ed.
yeah, but thanks for sharing that. I hadn't heard that. I'll look into it more.
And
But I think that our distance students deserve, a different model than the old model trying to be adapted. We talked with Ruben Puentedora recently on this podcast, and his model, his SAMR model, shows us how we can progress into a new way of teaching using these technologies, and it's not happening in my institution. I know that.
And I think there's some aspects. I mean, the one thing is that it's hard to change systems. I'm not going to lie about that. But education needs to get away from the industrial system of learning. And everything you described, Chris, where you see this perversion of AI as a means to replace teachers, they're replacing the machine line, the assembly line aspect of teaching, which unfortunately consumes a very large percentage of what we do, you know, because of the nature of the beast, because of grades, because of semesters, because of the way people learn, because the way we hand off students and recognize that they know something that they didn't before. And we have to recognize that that's all a blind man's bluff, that all of those systems were built in the industrial world and in a way to systemize the scaling up of education from the apprenticeship model, which existed before. That was a good thing on the whole, but it brought with it severe costs, and the technology is what dictated a lot of the choices that we make there. It's time to reevaluate those choices because the reality is they never worked that well to begin with. And now we have all of these learning systems, which are alternative learning systems that have come up since the beginning of the PC, and then ultimately the internet, and now AI, and that people can just say, you know what, screw this system and everybody that's in it. I'm just going to teach myself. And that has both positive and negative consequences because now all of a sudden you're a stranger in a strange land. You're lost in a world where you have no guide. And that's what a good teacher is a guide. But a lot of teachers don't get the opportunity to be guides. Certainly not for a large percentage of their students who are just checking boxes to get through the industrial system, which never made any sense, doesn't really work, and creates outputs that are not terribly useful in many cases, because that's the other side of it. I've worked in architectural engineering firms and stuff, and they get a graduate who's got an architecture degree or an engineering degree, and they're like, I can't give this person any responsibility because they've never done anything. They've just talked about doing stuff. And until they do something, they can't, I don't know what they can really do. I'm only basing this on the fact that they have a degree from this institution or that they have this transcript or whatever. All of those things are spurious measures of what humanity really is. And to me, again, this is where we kind of disconnect because I think you accept the system a lot more than I do. That I think that these things are ways in which we can over time overcome the systems in the same way that industrial technology helped build it in the first place. Because we think this is an immutable thing that goes back to the Greeks. No, that's bullshit. This goes back 100 years, maybe 150. And certainly the modern iteration of it is really post World War II with the mass education movements of the GI Bill and things like that in this country. So
Well, I blame
yeah.
it on the Germans, but
Oh yeah, yeah. No, oh,
that's
there's a
for
great
Tom's
book.
benefit.
There's a great book on that. What was that author's name? Bryan. She was on the forum like about a year ago, comparing the American educational
Yes.
system to the German. What's her name again? Do you remember?
Give me a second. I'll bring it up.
I just totally zoned on it. You
So,
know?
Chris, I know we
Yeah.
have to let you go here.
Yeah.
So I just want to ask you to, just give it look into the future a little bit and, tell us either or what you're working on, plug your book. I want to hear more about that. And then where you
Yeah.
think education is going.
Whew. Well, so the book, um, the elevator pitch is that um, ankle monitors and Apple Watches are essentially the same thing, and that you learn a lot um, by making that comparison about um, how the extent to which the technologies that people buy in the hopes that will benefit them um, often serve the interests of the companies less than the people who actually bought the devices. Um, I don't know. I wish I had a crystal ball. I'm not an optimist, uh, but my best my best imitation of an optimist is to say that um, I think that we are. I'll agree with Tom. Um, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing him when I say that we are currently kind of sort of reshaping what education is going to look like. Um, I am not, as I said, I'm not an optimist, but to imitate one, I think the pushback against um, sort of some of the worst authoritarian impulses of the current administration, I think is a place where I draw some encouragement or inspiration, and I hope that continues to be the case. Um, and yeah, other than that, I don't know. Um, yeah, I don't have a good answer. I apologize.
No, it's fine. I put you on the spot there. I'm going to agree with you and use the old Gramsci quote that I'm a pessimist of the intellect, but an optimist of the will. So I still work in higher ed, and you're still higher ed adjacent, and our friends here are both in higher ed. So I mean, we're all working for that future, even if we're a bit lost today. Um, Bryan dropped something in the chat here.
I'm answering Tom's question.
Yeah, that was the book that we were talking about. Yeah, Emily Levine, Allies and Rivals, German-American Exchange and the Rise of
Ah,
the Modern Research University. I thought,
Chris, I
yeah,
just want to say, Chris, I love how widely ranging your critique is of AI in education, as well as AI in society. I like how many different angles you approach this from. Um, and I think that suggests, well, obviously that you're brilliant and everyone should buy your book when it comes out, but also that just how deep and complex the problem is, how many moving parts it is. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have to keep talking and thinking about it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that compliment. That really means a lot. Thanks for inviting me, having me on. And yeah, I mean, I guess the even after everything I've said, I mean, one of the things I would like to assert, is I don't I don't think that everyone should behave in the way that I do. Like, uh, both in sort of a practical sense and um from like uh in other ways, right? Like, I value the ways that other people are approaching it. Um, and so a lot of what I said, I think uh, I stand by it, but I think it's important to say, like, I think I understand that not every that's not a mode of existence for everyone. But this has been an absolute pleasure. I'm always happy to chat with Mark and Brian, and it's nice to meet you, Tom, and I really enjoyed speaking with you as well.
likewise.
Please take care of yourself.
yeah, we
Enjoy
we
it.
appreciate. Sorry, Bryan, go ahead.
I was just saying, enjoy spring in Southeast Michigan, which I know is like about 15 seconds long and is mostly a
Yeah.
rapid oscillation between winter and summer.
It's true, but it's finally here for like a day or two, so it's nice.
Yeah.
And we all need thoughtful digital monks like you. And I do appreciate that considerably. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that I really appreciate you bringing your point of view into this conversation. And I want to say I've enjoyed our conversation and want to thank Chris Gilliard for joining Bryan Alexander, Tom Haymes, and me today and talking with machines. Good day.
What's that sound? Everybody look.